Hello, and welcome to another in our series of conversations with authors, writers, illustrators, you name it, from the wonderful catalogue of New Haven Publishing. Today, I'm extremely happy to have with us Jon Kremer, who's written a book. Well, I'm not going to tell you about it because we're going to talk about it. So let me bring on Jon. There you are.
Hi, Tim. How very nice to meet your acquaintance.
It's lovely to see you. It is because I've been so enjoying your book. It captures so much of my own life, actually, which was quite extraordinary to see. But I'm trying to think the best way to explain what it is. It's all about connections, isn't it? The book, I should say up front, is called Chain Reaction. Great name. And that really does sum it up, I guess. In the opening of the book, you use this quote, a pathway through the patterns of lost infinity, which is a great quote to open anything with. Can you explain that?
Well, off the top of my head, I think I've taken that from the great British sci-fi soap opera, really, for the late 1970s, early 1980s, called Blake 7. And in that, there is a wonderful forerunner of, supercomputers or quantum computers, really, coupled with super AI. And it has a line in the final episode in which I think it's managed to trace a pathway through the patterns of infinity. I know it's super sci-fi mumbo jumbo, but this book is merely a more hopefully humane attempt to look at pop and rock history, maybe things a little under the radar or things that have been noticed then forgotten. There are very sort of slight and slender lines of connectivity, but have inflection points that turn out to be, I thought, very, very, very significant. So I've written 16 chapters in Chain Reaction, and the full title is Chain Reaction, Rock and Pop's Magic Moments. And in a sense, it's the magic moment element of it that the chapters are about. And there are little stories. They are revisiting well-known biography, if you like, of Beatles, Stones, Dylan, Bowie, superheroes of the 60s, early 70s, but trying to find a fresh slant on key moments that maybe change something in it. And that's basically what the book's about. Actually, if I could just quickly say, I'm really also a very big fan of another New Haven publication, which is Tim's autobiography. Sounds like a mutual appreciation society here, but for a moment it is. It's true.
Yeah, this is product placement.
Yes, this is the place for it. This is Teddy TV.
This is great. Yes, I couldn't agree more.
But Tim has a very pronounceable name, Quinn. Mine tends to be pronounced in all sorts of ways, from Kremer to Kramer to Creamer, and it's actually Creamer. But almost anything on any radio interview, anything, almost always. In fact, I usually start off by talking to a producer who says something like, "Oh, yes, I'll get that across. It's Creamer," and then as soon as it starts, it's Kramer or Kremer.
You know, this was a topic I brought up with our wonderful publisher earlier today. I said, "How do you pronounce his name?" I said, "I don't want to start off by getting his name wrong." Wonderful. I've started off by getting your name wrong.
Do you know
about that?
Do you know the Super Ms. Darlin would not actually know unless she'd seen something on YouTube or something. So probably not. But anyway. On with the show, as they say.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think we should start maybe before coming to the book with a bit of your background, because I think we're at similar age. So, and I in many ways, we've been in similar areas in our lives.
Yes.
If I mention Bournemouth a Go-Go, Can you explain something about that to our nonplussed listeners?
Okay. Well, many years back, about a decade or so back, after a long period of gestation, so we say, I finally got round to writing a book. I say finally. I came across an old schoolboy diary some years ago in which I was aged 14, and I'd rather enigmatically written on one day a little entry saying, "I've had a great idea. I'm going to write a book." Well, as a very close friend of mine pointed out, 50 years later, I actually did. And it was autobiographical. It was called Bournemouth A Go-Go, a 60s memoir. And as the title indicates, it was a music-based book about my interactions with various people, some of whom became very well known. In fact, some were already very, very well known because there was a group, a Liverpool combo called the Beatles, who happened to come across. So they formed 3 chapters, and the main USP of the book, I would say.
I mean, it is such a lovely story, that, because I was there in '63. I was hanging around the stage door, hoping for a glimpse. Obviously, didn't get one because they had a better way into the theatre here in Southport. But you masterminded a wonderful ruse. You and a friend.
Well, indeed. Well, the story kind of became very well known as years went on for 2 reasons. It got given the title, I'm not quite sure how now, Lost in Mysteries, the Mists of Time, called The Men from Rickenbacker. And the men involved happened to be me as a 16-year-old. I am actually a good few years older than Tim, but we are in the same ballpark as baby boomers. And my good friend, who was a year and a half older than I, and is still my good friend, 6 decades on, and is still 18 months older than me, a singer-songwriter, Al Stewart. Of course, then he was Al Stewart in a Bournemouth beat group. And in fact, I was playing guitar a bit then as well, very poorly, and soon stopped. But because my friend went on to become a celebrated singer-songwriter with a couple of double platinum hits back in the 70s, and Al would sometimes in interviews, sometimes in print or radio, whatever, or in stage shows, because he's always been in between songs, he would like to come up with bits of chat and be very interesting, very amusing. And he would use this story, and people liked it, and it became very, very well known. And of course, over time, the Beatles, when we met them, it was The Week She Loves You was released. And Britain's Beatlemania, the blue touch paper had been lit.
Well, it's funny that, because that's the very week that I saw them for the first time.
Yes, now, this is going to be an absolutely, I was going to try and avoid this. There are things in both my books that I'm sure, in fact, reviews have pointed out, oh, you've got that wrong, or you've got that wrong, or something else. And I would hesitate to point out that I think the date when you saw them in Southport might have been a different date than the ones printed in your book. It's
what
only for the...
What are you suggesting? That I got it wrong? It's just August the 26th. It is ingrained in my...
August the 26th, that's it. That's the week following them being in Bournemouth. It's just
how about
in your book, I misread it as being the week before.
No, August the 26th. At 6:30 show. 6:30 show. Not that I'm a nerd or anything, but 6:30 show.
That's something I know you'd have right. I thought it said the 20th in the book instead of the 20th. It's obviously the 26th.
I'm going to go back to the book at some point and double check with a felt tip pen, no less.
I've just seen the ebook version of it, the Kindle version. So you never can tell. When I read that, I thought, you won't get that wrong. And I thought, it's probably the 26th or the 28th or something. It's only from the point of view that I was actually with them on the 20th of August.
No,
And,
absolutely. I
it's
understand.
such an extraordinary small world.
That's my point. Well, again, what a
Yes,
connection! What a strange
yeah, no,
connection.
it
You know,
is absolutely bizarre because yeah, what I was going to
not
say, because
only
the Beatles become exponentially what we know they become,
it was
every
such a week.
small thing to do with them is of interest.
It
It's of
is.
interest if you
Yeah.
read Tim's book and his experience with them. It's of interest if you're interested in the Beatles. That's why every year there are umpteen new books published on them. There's probably 3,000 or 4,000 that have been written, literally so far, of which there's probably 20 or 30 that are really essential.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But because they became so all encompassing in popular culture, and that's transgenerational now. And a acquaintance of mine, some long standing now, is Mark Lewison, who most people think of as the doyen of Beatle historians, and he's put it so well that the music now it transcends generations. It's not wait to see if they're going to be in history. We're half a century plus into it. We know they're in history. So because people are so interested, even my little story, and helped by Al becoming a success, has kind of become something. Fairly late in the day, I wrote my version of it, which is 3 chapters in Bournemouth a Go-Go. And I'd like to say, how can I put it? Mine is the version with the most accuracy and veracity. My good friend Al, when he's used it as a stage thing, it's quite different. It's not like writing something or documentary. If you're giving stage entertainment, in a show, it's quite different, and it's mutated over time the way he tells the story. I mean, at one point, we're knocking on the door of the Beatles' dressing room door. I've jumped forward a bit with this to how we actually get there, and it's opened by Neil Aspinall. Now, I mention this because Neil Aspinall is someone that Tim knew quite well. I know from your book.
Well, I certainly know his son extremely well, Rogue Aspinall Best, who runs the Liverpool Beatles Museum. Wonderful,
yes,
wonderful.
Of course, yes. Yeah, well, Neil, of course, sadly no longer with us.
I knew Neil through Derek. Yeah, so Derek Taylor.
Well, that's the fabulous Derek Taylor, who, of course, ghost wrote Brian Epstein's autobiography, A Cellar Full of Noise.
And indeed, I suspect you would agree, one of those 20 essential Beatle books you must have is As Time Goes By. Yeah. Derek's.
Yes, I have a first edition hardback copy of Derek's autobiography, completely essential. I think the very first proper book on the Beatles, 64, American writer called Michael Braun.
Love Me Do, The Beatles' Progress.
Exactly, yes. Which is still in print to this day.
Isn't it an astonishing book?
Well,
because it's word for word what they're saying through that.
The context of the time, it was still, Tim, not a million miles away from Cliff Richard and the equivalent, who wanted to be in show business, who wanted to be all-round entertainers, who, if they could make some money, they'd maybe like to buy their mum and dad a bungalow somewhere, and nobody would speak like the Beatles spoke.
No.
And the first thing that put it into print, how they did speak and how they were real, was this book, Love Me Do. The first of the great books, but the Derek Taylor book, yeah, absolutely marvelous. I've gone a long way off being here.
Yeah.
When Neil Aspinall opens the door to the Beatles' dressing room, and in the reality of the story, as I recounts it in my memoir, he takes one look at us and wonders, how the heck have we managed to get there? And afterwards, I kind of thought, well, what's gone through his thoughts? Well, the Beatles were playing 6 nights, if you can believe, in a row in Bournemouth. It was the first night. the place was surrounded by maybe 1,000, if not screaming girls, some of them were, but people. It was that difficult era of the Beatles being able to be smuggled in and out of venues. He probably thought, if we managed to get there, I don't know, maybe we're the offspring of the mayor of Bournemouth or something, he'll go with it. And he also went with the particular line I was still spinning at the time. But and he said, okay, wait here. Okay. In Al's version, it's become over the years that Neil Aspinall opens the door. And for those who don't know Neil Aspinall, he was the Beatles' road manager in the days when they actually didn't even have a road crew. It's just him, Mal Evans, his assistant, and the Beatles. And he, if you like, is the gatekeeper everywhere. Eventually, he becomes the CEO of Apple Corps. Long after the Beatles have split, he's still the head man there, well into the 21st century. But then in our story, it's Neil Aspinall tries to throw us out and is, you know, pushing us back down the corridor, etc. None of this actually happened. But I've come to believe over many years that I'm not sure if you're familiar with a movie of the early 60s called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Yes, of course.
At the end of the film, there's some dialogue, I think Jimmy Stewart, and there's a question of a newspaper maybe printing the story of what's happened. And are they going to print what happened? Are they going to print the legend? And I'm paraphrasing the punchline, which is print the legend. And in a sense, my version is my version, it happens to be true. But over time, I guess it's just whatever the story becomes is the best thing. Anyway, this is most of what Bournemouth to Go goes about. Just briefly, the rest of it tends to be about my friendship with Al, how we become friends, how I'm involved with trying to help his career and listen to his songs, because at first no one wants to listen, how we do all sorts of things to try and promote him, how eventually he starts to make records. And from the very earliest recordings he's made that I've made with him, maybe a decade on from trying, we're side by side in Studio 2, the Beatles studio in Abbey Road. He's recording A Year of the Cat, and he's turning to me as he would have done 10 years ago and saying, well, what did you think of it? And it's a kind of an overnight success that took 10 years. But in Bournemouth at the time, there was an extraordinary scene. There were groups that had members that went on to become, besides Al, very, very well known. There was there's a band called the Sands Combo that became the Zoot Money Band, and Zoot Money has sadly recently passed away. But his lead guitar player, who we knew, was Andy Summers, who in the 80s with the Police becomes probably the biggest band in the world for a while. And then in the 70s, another local Bournemouth guitar player was Robert Fripp of King Crimson, etc. fame, now probably best known for his YouTube shows with his wife Toya. So there was quite a lot I could sort of write about my time in Bournemouth in the 60s, which is my very long answer to Tim's inquiry.
Yeah, well, so already right back, there's all these connections and collisions of people, even in Bournemouth. I mean, I love that because everybody knows Liverpool because of what happened here, but perhaps a little less known is that these kind of things were happening all over the country at that time. That youth yeah. was actually doing extraordinary, truly extraordinary things.
It is so, yeah. I mean, we live in a modern world where people now are talking of that period correctly as history, because it is. The trouble with history is, I guess it's whoever's telling it. There's been a kind of revisionist thing in the last decade or two, possibly to do with the way the economics of the world have gone, looking at certain aspects of the 60s in a negative way. And it's almost always from people who don't actually understand that, one, the 60s didn't start when the clock struck midnight in 1959, December 31st.
Mm.
They basically start in the first week of October 1962, because on one day in that week,
The 5th.
indeed,
Yes.
as you do know, the Beatles' Love Me Do is released, and in the West End in London, the first James Bond film, Dr. No, is premiered. If you want to know where the 60s start, it's there. But then the 60s is a game of two halves, rather 2/3 and a third. From 62 to 67, there's this great thing that Tim's mentioned of youth, and it is youth that change pop culture. It changes popular music, it changes clothes, humor, eventually politics, everything. But after 67, and I almost date it to August Bank Holiday in England at the end of August 67, because within a day or two of the end of that month, Brian Epstein, who is so significant in the creation of all this, sadly passes away. And at the same time, Andrew Loog Oldham, who's discovered and is the Svengali of the Rolling Stones, parts company with them. And to me, the 60s then began to finish. And the last 2 or 3 years, it's a much darker 60s. There's huge protest about the Vietnam War, quite understandably. And from 68, 69, 70, that is not the same 60s as Beatlemania in England or Beatlemania the year later in America.
We kind of lost the joy. There was a joyousness,
Yes.
perhaps best caught by that wonderful shot of the Beatles leaping in the air. Was it on the Long Tall Sally EP? That amazing
EP, actually,
moment.
yes. Yes, absolutely. It's
Sheer joy.
yeah, it does captures it absolutely completely. There's a very nice review on Amazon of Bournemouth A Go-Go, very fulsome review. And in it, the writer of it used a great expression that I liked for the 60s at the beginning and up to, say, 2/3 of the way through, which was the future seemed flooded with hope. And I think it did have that, and then it didn't. And if you like, half a century on, we're still in the, I'm not sure, where did that go? I don't know. I used a chapter title at the end of Bournemouth A Go-Go, which I lifted from a lyric from my friend Al Stewart's, a song of his called, I think it was Close World War II Blues, in which is a line, which way did the 60s go? Now Ramona's in Desolation Row. And in a sense, by the end of the 60s, it was really which way did the 60s go? Because somehow what it created is still percolating through to this day. In fact, there's a great David Bailey line, which he says, well, really the 60s never, ever finished. He said, if you want to see them, go out now and just look around, because the sense of the worth of the individual and the idea that that in itself engendered respect, that anything that you thought you could be, that comes first. All of this starts with the 60s, and that's what people now but basically take for granted.
There was a wonderful, wonderful line in a TV series that started round about 63, and it's stand by for action. Anything can happen in the next half hour. And to me, that totally sums up that whole period, because anything did happen in the next half hour.
Yes.
And I was watching from the most hideous of Victorian school systems, but outside the school walls, these amazing things were happening, and they were happening in my own hometown, Liverpool. And then the realization that it was not only across the UK, but then by 64 across the States, across, you name it, the whole world, all being turned on to that very word you used, hope, and the word I used, joy.
Absolutely.
of life. Life could be fun. Nobody had told me that before.
No, it's an extraordinary thing you say, Joy, because in a go-go, my book, I before meeting the Beatles, I describe. Actually, would you like me to tell this Men from Rickenbacker story?
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely. So because it sets everything up, and of course, we're here to talk about chain reaction, but this is really part of the chain reaction.
In a sense,
and I don't want to give too much away about chain reaction because I want, and I feel everybody just sitting listening to this interview will immediately want to buy it, because just the little things you're saying will make it a book that they will want on their shelves. But we will come to it in more detail. Sure.
If people are interested in the Beatles, and quite frankly, I've no idea why anyone wouldn't be.
Not quite.
But there's one chapter in Chain Reaction, which is well, the title basically is, I can't remember exactly, but it's along the lines: do the Beatles actually have to split and break up in 1970 if Bobby Darin from the 50s and 60s, big hits, singles maker of great songs and records, if he doesn't attend a wedding in 1959, do they still have to break up in 1970? And this gives you a flavor of the book. It sort of winds back a long way and tries to find lots and lots of chain reaction links that lead to something.
And then I have to throw in the name Chuck Yeager. Chuck Yeager and the Beatles. I've never seen that connection anywhere else in any Beatle book.
Well, yes, thank you. I think that's in the first chapter, the one about Steve Jobs' Apple and the Beatles' Apple, and it all links together through a surrealist painting, so you get an idea what the book's like. Yes. Oh, you like that? I just like the idea of. I had a John Lennon quote about them being lookouts in the crow's nest of a boat looking for cultural change. That's something he said in the early 70s. And I sort of gave a sort of counterbalance to that by mentioning Chuck Yeager and his, who, for the viewer listener, Chuck Yeager was America's ace test pilot in the late 1950s. And prior to the Mercury and Apollo astronaut missions, there's a precursor to that. What he did in an experimental jet plane was extraordinary. He flew it so high, he reached the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. He was that good and survived it. And I use this as a kind of, I'm not sure, not exactly a sort of simile, I suppose, in the book. But going back to the Men from Rickenbacker, before that actually happens, Al and I watched the Beatles perform in Bournemouth on their first show on the 19th of August 1963.
Any good?
I like them. And going by the people around me, and bizarrely, history always say it was Screaming Girls, you couldn't hear them. It was Screaming Girls, but you could hear them.
Yeah.
The chemistry was extraordinary. And a word that Tim used just now about being joyful, joyous, this is exactly how in the Go-Go I described them as a band of joy bringers, because you got this strange endorphin rush. Now, I'd seen quite a lot of, pop and rock shows by then. And of course Al had. We'd never seen anything like it, because it wasn't just they sounded great and the songs were great and that they looked great, but they came across with this phenomenal feeling of a kind of chemical energy. The synergy between them and the audience was just an extraordinary thing. Being anyone who's seen them, Tim saw them a few days later. So this is pretty accurate, isn't it? It's like nothing else, that feeling you got from them.
Oh, well, I'm still vibrating from that show. Admittedly, it had all of Epstein's lead signings on there with them, the foremost, Cilla Black, Billy J. Kramer, and Jerry and the Pacemakers. I mean, my God. So it was a show like, well, I'd yet to see another show like that.
Yeah. No, well, you had the complete experience. That's the, They did have as a support, well, it's a package show, so there are a lot of other acts, but their main support, excuse me, was Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. And it so happened that it was the day we were backstage after the show. It was Billy J. Kramer's 20th birthday then, and they were celebrating it in the dressing room. In fact, when almost the first thing John Lennon says to me is he came out the dressing room, he says, "I can't ask you in, it's just too busy in there." And we didn't realize, Al and I, till a little later. In fact, the party continued. They were staying at a hotel just like 2 doors away from the venue, which was actually basically normally a theatre, a cinema, but also a theatre called the Gaumont in Bournemouth. And they were staying at a hotel called the Palace Court Hotel, 2 doors away, and the party continued there. But back at the story, yes, having seen them live, the last number they did was Twist and Shout, which is probably what Tim saw as well, because they kind of did tend to finish with Twist and Shout then. When the show finished, and as the auditorium slightly emptying from this, very buzzy high, as I said, Al and I were involved with local Bournemouth groups. He much more than I, for the simple reason that he could play guitar very well, and he knew a lot about them. Now, everybody knows Rickenbacker guitars, but I can tell you in 1963, they didn't. They grew to know them because of the Beatles, first John Lennon, then George Harrison. And then the Byrds start using one, the 12-string Rickenbacker, and that's it. Then you could know about Gibson guitars, Fender, Guild guitars, Hofner, Epiphone, but that was about it. And John Lennon, as everyone now knows, there are in fact YouTube things dedicated just to John Lennon's Rickenbacker guitar and its fame. He's playing this black short-scaled Rickenbacker guitar. I didn't know what it was. And as it finished the show, I turned to Al and I said, "Do you know what the guitar is John Lennon's playing?" And he said, "Well, I think it's a Rickenbacker." He was probably the only person in Bournemouth who could have said this, excuse me, at the time. And I said off the top of my head, and I have to tell you that though I was 16, he's 17 and a half, I did tend to look quite a bit older. I looked maybe 19, maybe 20. And people have to understand that the music business in England, ever since the late 50s, had a lot of very, very young people in it on all sides of the recording desk. For example, the Shadows drummer, Tony Meehan, when they made Apache 3 years earlier, was only 16. So otherwise what I say sounds even more ludicrous than it probably is going to sound. I turned to Al off the top of my head. I said, "Wouldn't it be great if we could get to talk to John Lennon about his guitar? Wouldn't that be good?" And Al looked at me quite correctly, and he'll tell you this is true, basically in a slightly quizzical way, and was also as if I'm mad, saying, "Well, how are we going to do this?" Because outside the theatre, in the road outside and in an alleyway along the side of it that led to the stage door, it was absolutely jammed. There's a photograph of this on the back cover of my first book, and you would just see a sea of people. There were police trying to hold them back from the stage door. How are we going to do this? And I don't know why. I said, "Why don't we go to the manager of the theatre's office? Don't say we've just seen the Beatles, but say we are representatives of Rickenbacker guitars. We've just come down from London. We've got an appointment with the Beatles management. We can't get backstage because of all these screaming girls. Can you help?"
That is such a 60s idea.
This is almost verbatim what then happened. We made our way to the door, the door of the manager's office. Knock, knock. Go in. There's a couple of desks there. There's a middle-aged guy sitting behind one desk. The other desk is empty. There's no one there. And rather incongruously, I thought he had a large, not started yet, it looked like, pint of beer in front of him. And he said, yes, can I help you? At this point, I walk forward slightly and Al stays, and again, he will admit this. He admits it to his fans, near the door to this office, in case we have to make a speedy retreat. He wants to be first out the door. I said to the manager, my name is, gave him my name, this is Mr. Stewart. We've just come down from London. We're trying to see the Beatles management. We've got business with them about Rickenbacker guitars. Can't get backstage. Can you help? This was the idea. I espoused to Al, and this is what I said. And he looked at me for about half a second. And then he said, what was your name again? I said, my name is Kremer, and this is Mr. Stewart. He said, right. And he picked up either a telephone or an intercom to the stage door and said, Mr. Kremer and Mr. Stewart are coming round, let them in. I said, right, well, thank you very much. It's terrific. We exchanged a few words about this huge crowd outside and all of that. And we left. I didn't think of it till afterwards, but I kind of thought he'd got this far into a week of chaos with the Beatles and everyone around the place. It was beyond anyone's expectation when they went into his job that they would one day have to deal with this sort of mania. And I think he just thought, do this and go back to his pint of beer. Mm-hmm. We left, and then we had problem number two, which was to gain access to the stage door around the side, we had to get through this crowd. And believe it or not, a couple of bobbies who were holding them to one side, we explained something about what the manager was doing. We were expected at the stage door, and he helped hold them back. Excellent. This included one or two people, a couple of girls that we knew that were looking at us and wondering what on earth was happening here. By the time we got to the stage door, it was behind little railings and a sort of kind of locked gate. And the stage door guy, young guy, has got the door open and he's saying, you know, if I open this, he said, you can come in, but they're all going to rush in after you. This is just terrible. At this point, there were girls pushing autograph books onto us because they thought we were going to be getting access. One way or another, to cut a very lengthy story, a little shorter. We get in, we're backstage, terrific. Then I suppose problem number three arrives, which is anyone who's been listening to this so far and hasn't found it too boring would realize we haven't come from London. We're not representatives of Rickenbacker guitars. We have no reason to be there. It's very busy.
Minor point, surely.
Well, at this point, Al and I kind of like freeze into statues and like an elastic band snapping back into shape. We revert to being ourselves. There's people moving around from, you know, the various acts, bands, backstage, stage hands. And I get hold of somebody, I think it was probably one of the Dakotas. And I said, which way to the Beatles dressing room? Excuse me, he said, well, directs us, go down a narrow sort of corridor. At one end, there's a door. And as I mentioned, we knock on the door. Rather, I knock on the door. Door opens. It's Mr. Aspinall. Looks at us, as I say. He said, I said, I just reverted to the truth at that point. I said, we're in local beat groups. Never mind how we got backstage. We just wondered if we could, you know, chat with John Lennon about his Rickenbacker guitar. Just wondered, you know. So he said, oh, okay, wait here. Closes the door. Great, we wait there. Not very long passes. The door opens, and it's not Neil Aspinall. It's someone out 20 minutes earlier, just seen singing Twist and Shout. It's John Lennon. He says very apologetically, I can't ask you in. It's too crowded in there. As I say, they were having this birthday party for Billy J. Kramer's 20th. And I must mention at this point, over time, a number of people used to point out that his name sounded like mine, J. Kremer, only his with an A and mine with an E. And I had to point out, well, actually, his real name was William Ashton, but that's by the by.
It was indeed.
John Lennon had changed out of his stage suit. He was wearing a blue denim shirt and he had horn rimmed glasses on. Now, this might mean nothing to anyone now, in '63, John Lennon was not seen in public, and there weren't photos of him in horn-rimmed glasses. He was, as we all know, very, very short-sighted. It's really not until, well, actually 1966, when he puts on the little round wire-rimmed glasses.
I always thought that's such a shame. But I came round eventually. So
yes. Oh, you should have stayed with the authentic Hanky Marvin Buddy Holly look. That was classic. Well, he in fact, his glasses become so well known in the wire-rim ones that even people call them Lennon glasses in those days.
Absolutely, but only he could have done that. Only he could have taken granny glasses and made it cool.
Exactly.
Only John, or possibly Harry Potter.
It's the icon of icons, Mr. John Winston Lennon.
Yeah.
Well, or later John Ono Lennon, as he preferred to be known. But I just thought, wow, it to me almost seemed like a shared moment of intimacy that he didn't mind.
Yeah,
he was chatting with us. So he's very laconic, very low key. I already knew enough that we knew the Beatles didn't suffer fools gladly, and that John Lennon didn't suffer them at all. So there was a slight degree of trepidation, but he turned out to be absolutely great. He said, the first thing he said was, what did you think of it, the show? What can you say? He said, absolutely fantastic. It was absolutely terrific. Blah, 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 blah. But we had to be maybe 50 foot from the stage, facing the left-hand side of the stage. Now, anyone who knew the Beatle lineup at the time would know that John Lennon was on the right, and McCartney and Harrison would be grouped around one mic to his right. And we're directly in front of George Harrison's amp. And we said, well, actually, we couldn't hear your guitar too loudly because, George Harrison's was much louder. And he said something like, oh, bloody George. He said, I'll sort that out, because they used to play two shows a night in those days. And this was in between the first show and the second house. And he said, I'll sort that out. There is a little story about that can maybe come another time. So we start chatting, and we chat. He said, we're just so interested in your guitar. And he said, oh yeah. He said, I think got it in Hamburg. I think it originally had been white, and he painted it black or something. I didn't know at the time it was called a Capri 335 or 353, something like that. And it gave me the impression that he really wasn't that interested in guitars. Now, most people in groups, you could chat to them about guitars. They were pretty interested. He wasn't that interested. So we talked a little bit more, and out of complete bravado, because I wanted to show that we were, I don't know, we were cool. We were cool. I mentioned another band that I thought we really liked. That, I said, you're great, but we think they're also great. Now, this would again sound ridiculous, because the band at the time, I say bands, they were called groups then. I said the Rolling Stones. There's some context. The Rolling Stones were hardly known outside of bits of London. They'd released their first record.
Come on.
Come on. Thank you very much. A small Chuck Berry song, small by his canon anyway. But from their stage act, this record, Come On. It was only 3 weeks before. I'd known of them a little bit earlier than that, because there was an article in the Record Mirror before they made a record by a guy called Norman Joplin. And the editor of the Record Mirror, it's a guy called Peter Jones, had he was the reason Andrew Loog Oldham discovers the Rolling Stones, by the way. He'd written this article for Peter Jones, and I knew about them, etc., etc. So I thought, this is a cool thing to say. And he said, he says, no, we like the Stones, they're great. I hadn't realized at that time that George Harrison had seen them in Richmond, and it was George Harrison that helped talk Dick Rowe at Decca Records into signing Rolling Stones.
Yes.
So we were on really safe ground saying this to John Lennon without sounding too much like Smart Alex. But then he says this fantastic thing. He said, would you like to see it? He said, I can't ask you in again. He says, stay here. He goes back in the dressing room, and he comes out with his black Rickenbacker guitar.
Mm.
6 months, 6 months later, the following February, 73 million people in America see him playing this guitar on the Ed Sullivan Show, and he hands it to me. Now, Al will tell everyone, has always told his fans or whatever. In fact, there's an article in the Times in the early 21st century in which they print the story as his stage show version, in which John Lennon hands him the guitar. Actually, he hands the guitar to me, which is terrific, except for one thing, that anyone paying attention to this will realize I said that I wasn't very good. I'd only taken it up because one of the great things was if you play guitar, girls liked it. And then I realized it was much too hard work to do this, and there were easier ways to attract girls. So that was it.
I have to ask, did you get Bert's book, Playing a Day?
Yes, Bert's great. Well, fortunately, I managed to swerve this because a lot of my biography at the beginning. That's what
I bought the guitar and the book, and the problem with that book is it doesn't stipulate which day it is that you're going to learn the guitar.
Yes, well, Bert Breeden was actually a good professional guitar player, but everyone would start with, as indeed Tim did, Playing a Day, Bert Weedon, and the Buddy Holly songbook, which you could buy, and it would have all the chords in it, and you could play Peggy Sue, and within if not a day, you could certainly play the guitar a bit. Actually, the most amazing thing about the guitar, digressing a bit, is of all the musical instruments, it's probably the only one in which you can pick it up, and if it's in tune, you can very, very quickly be shown how to get something out of it, some sort of sound. At the other end of the scale, it goes on and on and on, so you have to be Segovia or the most brilliant guitar player to really, really explore it. I mean, if you want to play a trumpet, this is not the case. You can't pick it up and get something out of it. And eventually, if you're going to be Louis Armstrong or Miles Davis, right, that's as far as it goes. The guitar has got such a huge capacity in it. But anyway,
with John's guitar in your hand.
Yeah, so I'm stuck in this position where I'd quickly given up all this beat group idea, or in the process of it, partly because Al was so good and it was just silly. And I'll be watching people like Bob Fripp, as he was known then, or Andy Summers, and I thought this is just silly. But he's handed it to me. Now I don't know. Again, I'm sure with Tim, if you played a guitar, you'd have a strap around it, you put it around your neck, or you'd be sitting down. I was stuck in this position where John Lennon, of all people, has handed me his guitar that I can just about play. And I'm standing there on one leg, balancing it, a bit like a flamingo. And I very quickly played, I played a little bit of Joey and Eddie's Shazam, I think, and a little chord progression up and down it. And then stopped, and I just said, "Oh, it's fantastic action," which it had. It's very low, and it was a very short scale guitar. Again, anyone who's a guitar player will know this. It had a very short neck, which went straight into the guitar body, which you can go all the way to the top of it on. Anyway, I very quickly handed it to Al. At this point, everything he says about it's true. He then plays it much better, terrific. And Lennon just sort of stands there, kind of leaning against the wall, looking at it. You know, it's very laconic. It's very okay. If that's what you can do, fine, terrific. And then he goes into this slight diatribe about the amp he plays, because we've been talking about it. And the Beatles used Vox amps made by a firm called Jennings. Now, I think at the time were getting free amps, because I think Lennon actually said to us that Brian Epstein had made some deal with Vox, and they were getting these amps. But Al said to him, he said, "I know when you're recording in Abbey Road, he said you use Fender amps, which were actually much superior." And he says, Al's talking with Lennon about, why do you do this? Anyway, so Lennon explains this Epstein thing, and then he says, sometimes he says, probably with the location, Bournemouth in mind, he says, sometimes I like to throw it off the bloody pier. And this was the nature of our conversation with John Lennon. It didn't last very, very long. but it's, I say it didn't last very long. For us now, it's lasted over 60 years. So it was quite a lengthy conversation in that regard. Anyway, he said, I've got to go. He said, I've got to go and get changed and get back in the dressing room. And that was the end of it. And then we made our way back into the real world and into the August streets of a sunny night evening in Bournemouth, still thronged with people, particularly from the show, and thought, wow, what's just happened here? Never realizing the Beatles would go on exponentially. Al would eventually make records and have platinum hits. Our story would then get repeated, not only by us, but at various times in newspapers, magazines, books, radio, television, concert halls, tour programs. If you'd have said that to us, we'd have said, yeah, okay, right, I don't think so. But the thing is, we then thought, they're here for a week. The next day, Tuesday, we got together in the afternoon because we kind of slept through the morning. And we came up with the idea of, if we can talk our way backstage, sure, we can talk our way into their hotel 2 doors away. There was a kind of commissionaire guarding their hotel at the time, guy in uniform, trying to keep people out who weren't hotel guests. And I came up with another, what some people call a scam these days, to get us into the hotel. Because when we were backstage, we kind of chummed up a bit with a couple of the Dakotas, particularly their bass player, Ray Jones. And he said, right, see you around sometime. This was after the Lennon meeting, so we left. And I said to him, I'll tell you what, if we can get in, we'll ask for Ray Jones, because they were staying there as well, Billy Joe and the Dakotas. And that will be our way in to the Beatles. Okay. But first we had to get past this this hotel commissioner guy outside, and they've got the doors locked actually, except for guests. It's a very nice hotel, 4-star hotel. I said to this chap, myself and my colleague, we're from the Bournemouth Echo, which was a daily evening newspaper. We're here to interview the Beatles. And said, oh, right, okay, open the door. We walked in, go up to reception. There was a middle-aged couple chatting there, and they moved to one side. I'd forgotten. The commissioner said, oh, yes, he says, go through. He says, your colleague is already there. He's in the lounge on the first floor. So I said, oh, thank you very much. Trying to compute this, your colleague. So we go in, at which point we realise, we're not only not from Rickenbacker, we're also obviously not from the Echo. So at the reception, young woman, I say, I'd like to speak to Mr. Jones, Ray Jones, not sure of his room number. He says, bum, right. Puts us through, puts us on. So, hi, it's us from yesterday. You know, you said, see us around. Well, we're around. Oh, he says, it's room number so-and-so, come up. So rather energetically for Al and I, we sprint up the stairs to his room, which is in the days pre to Keith Moon and the Who deciding to trash hotel rooms as being part of rock and roll being de rigueur. And it's a very neat as a pin room. And bearing in mind Ray Jones, before Epstein discovers them, they're a Manchester group, actually, that you probably know this, Tim. He puts together with Billy Joe, and they have this lovely touch. They weren't called Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. It says Epstein touch here, Billy J. Kramer with the Dakotas.
Right.
Subtle but meaningless. But
I have to jump in and say I do know that. And the reason I know it, well, probably because I did know it back then, but less than a month ago, I was in the Liverpool Beatles Museum in front of a huge crowd, interviewing Billy J. Kramer himself.
Oh,
it was sheer joy, because we had about 2 hours just to go right from his very earliest memory all the way through to what he's doing this coming year. And anybody who's interested, do keep an eye out on Billy J's website, because he's doing all sorts of interesting things in the coming year.
Ah, that's fantastic.
Coming up. So
Small
yeah,
world. And you
it
can
is again. It's these connections. It's this chain reaction. I can't help but
it's
say it is.
synchronicity.
Everything's connected in
Ah,
some way.
wow. Ray was a great guy, and he'd originally been a bank clerk, or whatever one would call one, bank teller. And we said, we talked about the night before, the crowd and everything, and he's just thought it's this incredible, this Beatlemania thing. We said, where are they now? And he said, they're in the lounge. He says, with the back, excuse me, the other Dakotas. He said, I was just going to go and join them. Come, we'll go and join them. So we go down to the lounge, which was on the first floor of the hotel. And the frontage of the hotel was like an Art Deco building, 4 or 5 stories high, with open balconies running the length of it. And the lounge was on, as I said, the first floor. And one end of it had been roped off from the other guests for the Beatles and the rest of the show that was there for the week. And just in passing, as Tim was saying, obviously the Beatles in Liverpool, but most people would probably be surprised to know that in all their time in England, they played more times in Bournemouth than anywhere in the country except Liverpool and London. Quite extraordinary. First of all, 2 shows a night for 6 nights that August. Yeah. And in December of that year, 63, they played at another venue in Bournemouth called the Winter Gardens. And it's actually the start of Beatlemania in America, because before they go to America in February the next year, all 3 of the major American networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, did a news feature on them, as a documentary news feature. And it was from the Bournemouth Winter Garden show of December that they filmed them. In fact, you can see this on YouTube if you're really keen. And they came back to Bournemouth again the next year, played here again. So it was a lot of dates. But so we go down to the lounge where it's kind of this roped off thing. And near the balcony windows at a table are John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Paul McCartney wasn't around at that moment. I don't quite know where he was, but we didn't see him at that point. And at the table next to them was the Dakotas, a guy called Mike Maxfield on lead guitar. Tony Mansfield, I think, was the drummer. He was very interesting to chat to because his sister was a singer, also from Manchester, and she was just about to get a recording contract. Elkie Brooks, thank you.
Yeah, cool.
This is so great to be having this chat with Tim, because every now and again I had chats with the odd radio thing over the years, and no one is going to jump in and see Elkie Brooks, which is terrific. But it took Elkie Brooks, like Al Stewart, like 10 years to be an overnight success with Pearl's the singer. But before that, she was in a group called Vinegar Joe with the late Addicted to Love, Robert Palmer, which was a very good group. So there were things to chat with. The Dakotas had just had a top 10 hit themselves, a guitar instrumental, a bit Shadows-like, called The Cruel Sea.
Yeah, no, you're saying Shadow-like, but I always found the interesting thing about the Dakotas was that you would know it was the Dakotas. It was quite different to the Shadows, even though it was an instrumental and it was guitars and the same, but there was something that the Dakotas had that was so different to the Shadows.
Spot on, and I really meant instrumental. There were a 4-piece instrumental group, guitar, bass, rhythm guitar, drums. I meant Shadows. You're completely correct. Sound-wise, they had a terrific sound. And of course, they'd taken this from the title of a Nicholas Montserrat book called The Cruel Sea. And later, it was recorded in America by the America's version of the Shadows, the Ventures, and also Dick Dale, I think, who was the kind of surf guitar king. And they retitled it The Cruel Surf instead of The Cruel Sea. But so we were getting on very nicely chatting with the Dakotas. And we're sitting right next to the Beatles. three-quarters of them, and we realized that being interviewed by two guys, this is another bit of synergy with Tim, because you wrote about how you enjoyed, from the moment it was published, Beatles Monthly, all the way through to almost its last edition or issue, in which you have this great linkage for you as a chain reaction, which takes you to the love of your life, America, back and forth, which is just fantastic. And it comes from this periodical called Beatles Monthly. Exactly what you think it says on the tin. Well, this is the cool thing in our connection here. We're sitting next to them. They are being interviewed by Beatles Monthly for the second issue of Beatles Monthly.
Oh, wonderful.
The first one came out in August. It's for the second issue. And then this interview. Now they're being interviewed with, now I didn't know it at the time. Now in Beatles Monthly, and Tim will bear this out, it would have said it was somebody called like Johnny Dean or someone doing it. These were made up names. But the actual name of the guy doing, there were the two, but the main one interviewing them, and I knew this, I didn't get to know this till I mentioned Mark Lewison, who, anyone who doesn't know him, it's very simple. He is the world's greatest Beatle expert. It's not my opinion. The late George Martin said, Mark knows more about this than any of us. And his writing, I digress again if you don't mind for a second, a trilogy, A History of the Beatles. He started writing this around 2006. The first volume was published in 2013. People are still waiting for the second volume.
We are indeed. And in fact, I interviewed Mark a while back, and I said to him, you do realize how old I am? I've read the first book, and I'm very worried about the third book. So
well, I can tell you, gosh, last time I saw Mark a while back now, I said, look, I'm not going to ask you, when is this being published? I said, I'll ask you this, Mark. I said, have you started writing it yet? Because he spent so much time on the research, which is brilliant. And he said, well, actually, no, Johnny, I haven't. Actually, this was a few years back now. I know it's extremely well underway. And he's a really, really very nice guy. And if people want to know anything about the Beatles, let me put it this way. His first volume that Tim's well up to speed with is called Tune In. And the overall title of the trilogy is All These Years. Now, originally, he was going to take volume 1 up to the end of 1963. And he very kindly mentioned me in the acknowledgements of the first book, and he said how he'd include the Men from Rickenbacker story in it. But then it turned out, way back in 2013, that he decided not to finish it then, but to finish the book at the end of 1962. And the next volume would be 63 to about 67. Well, if one says the first volume takes the Beatles story only up to Love Me Do and finishes there, and it's a 1,000-page book, and this limited edition version is put out, which is nearly 2,000 pages, people will understand that this is quite something. Many people would take the Beatles story and write it, and they'll start with maybe when their parents were born. Mark starts the Beatles story in the middle of the 19th century.
He's got me there. Truly the foresight.
You know this in spades. Oh dear, how do we get to this? Yeah,
This is the problem with the Beatles. The Beatles have taken us an hour now.
Go down rabbit holes. Well, Mark told me many years ago. He said, the guy interviewing him for the Beatles Monthly, he said that was actually Peter Jones, the editor of Record Mirror.
Right.
That's extraordinary, because Peter Jones is the guy that tells Andrew Loog Oldham about the Rolling Stones and convinces him one day to take the train from Hampstead, and that's, people who don't know, in northwest London, down to Richmond, south of the river, one Sunday evening, to find his fate, his destiny, and become the person who brings the Rolling Stones into everyone's lives. And that's the same guy, Peter Jones. It's weird, but anyway, it's just I'm only saying this because I know you like you like Beatles Monthly for very, very good reasons.
Well, I appreciate that. I do. It's something that is not only close to my heart, but huge. It's a part of my heart, quite frankly, because, well, for so many reasons, not least the Beatles. And it's fascinating listening to you because we basically just talked about the Beatles. But what's come out of this is all these different connections, you know, which again ties back into the book that we're here to talk about, Chain Reaction, because the whole book covers really the whole pop and rock world. I mean, people as diverse as Dylan to Buddy Holly, Beatles to Chuck Yeager, Ready, Steady, Go, Bobby Darin, folk rock. Absolutely love what you've written about folk rock. And then, I think equally important to me, Things Ain't What They Used to Be, Lionel Bart. I mean, a huge part of the 60s, along with Tony Newley, without whom we know who wouldn't have been created, probably. No doubt, you know, David Bowie. All these things that you touch upon in your book, and write in great detail, are absolutely fascinating, because seeing it now from the distance, getting the bigger picture, which your book is basically the bigger picture, and it allows this connection from Chuck Yeager going up into the atmosphere, or out of the atmosphere almost, through to Peter Blake and Roxy Music, Hollies to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. I mean, these glorious connections, which to anybody not only of our age, but I mean, here's a beautiful thing. I have two neighbors. Next door, there's a 17-year-old who lives with his parents. Across the road is a 17-year-old girl who lives with her parents. Both of them are crazy now about all things 60s, and they look like they've just stepped out of the 60s. It's taken them over. And I've actually passed on the tech copy of your book because I knew they'd get it, and they adore it. So we're talking old codgers right the way through to these kids who are just stepping out of school, trying to find, and I suspect the word that they're trying to find is hope and joy in what is increasingly a joyless, bloody world, thanks to our hideous media, only dwelling upon the downside of things. And as soon as they hear it, as soon as they read about it, their fascination is, well, it's like, you know, why do you think I'm surrounded by this? I'm surrounded by Daleks and superheroes, and indeed superheroes, pointing the wrong way, on a crossing there. It's because it was truly it was a Camelot moment. There's a beautiful moment at the end of that movie Camelot where King Arthur is really down because everything has crashed. Everything has come crashing down. And suddenly he has this realization that forevermore, the memory will go on of that once upon a time there was Camelot, a Camelot moment. And how lucky are we, you and I, Jon, to have lived through such a glorious Camelot moment. And I'm not one to exaggerate, having worked in comic books, perish the thought of me exaggerate. But I think this is true. And I think, to bring it back to the Beatles, the word is love. I think it's that simple, isn't it? And your book is just so full of that. It shines out of each page. There's a story after story after story. As you think, well, how can this be? And the connections are made. It is truly a glorious book to read.
Well, I am extremely delighted. I mean, it would be absurd if I wasn't. But one of the great things, as you all know, when you've created something, and you've created a tremendous amount, is when you know someone absolutely gets it. I mean, with my friend Al Stewart, obviously, if people talk about Year of the Cat or Time Passages, which are a double platinum hit, but every now and again, someone will come up to him and mention one of his songs, and it's recorded and written over probably 150. That's also something he's very, very proud of and pleased with. And there's always that special extra free song of somebody absolutely gets it. I love your 17-year-old neighbours. The fact that it came to me a while back with the first book, actually, and you'll know this with Amazon, they've got their charts of what's selling and what isn't, and they list something as like being a number 142,000 or something ludicrous, and then they have other smaller charts and things in which they say it's in the I don't know, the biography chart or the books on gardening or whatever. And when A Go-Go came out, and I saw they also listed it as a history book, and I suddenly realized, well, of course it's a history book. To me, I'm writing about me and this or whatever. Of course, that's my history in a sense. But of course, it depends what you call a generation. But if we say maybe every 20 years, call it a generation, you've gone through 2 or 3 by now. Yeah. This is complete history for your 17-year-old. Just remember when you were 17, and if people talked of 50 or 60 years before, well, they're talking about the Victorian age. Yeah. It was a completely unrecognizable different world, and was history. Absolutely.
But no, there's no denying it. In fact, when I was asked to write my autobiography, I thought, well, my mother's dead, so who's going to buy it? Because I'm not a name as such. But then it was pointed out to me that I've worked in places and worked with people who are fascinating and interesting, and that people would be interested in. And also, it was pointed out to me that it's history, that what you do is now history. It's a bit like Samuel Pepys and how he amazingly brings the 1660s to life. And I think we all have a duty to do that so that this glorious age that we've been lucky enough to live through can be captured in 10,000 ways, because there are at least 10 million stories to be told of the naked city. Or
well, I remember it well. There are 8 million stories to be told. Naked
yes,
city.
Yes,
it was. Yes.
Well, you've certainly told many of them in this book. Many that I had no knowledge of whatsoever. When I was writing some notes to go up, not that I needed them today, but I've listed all sorts of things that I was going to ask you to go into more detail over. But then I was thinking, well, I don't want you to really, because that's the point of getting the book. And I don't want to spoil it for people. I don't want there to be spoilers. I think we've mentioned quite a few different things that are in there, but there's so much more as well. The book is, anybody listening in, please go to New Haven Publishing's website and Facebook page and see all the wonderful books they have there. And no, I'm not just pushing my own. I'm truly over the moon to be a part of this publishing company, because the books are quite diverse and quite extraordinary across certainly across music and popular culture. So you're going to get a real kick out of the books you see. But tune into Jon's book, Chain Reaction, for more details there. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Because I'm conscious that we could chat all night.
We'll have to call it whenever you choose. I must echo what Tim just said. New Haven Publishing, which is the creation of Teddy Darlin, is an absolutely splendid imprint. It has there are several imprints, including one Tim's very involved with, besides his autobiography, which is the sort of graphic novel end of New Haven, and all of it very, very worth exploring. Actually, it's so interesting. I did an interview on Talk Radio Europe that Teddy Darlin arranged, and that was great. And during it, though, I realised that I couldn't talk too much about the book, just as Tim has said, because it kind of takes away the point. Several of the chapters kind of have a punchline by the time you get to the end of them. but not all of them. Some of them it's flagged up more or less straight away, or you can guess it. But the story and the point of it is how it does come to be. But talking of briefly books, and before we finish, as Tom mentioned, sorry, Tim mentioned the world of comics, of which he, for many years, both in the UK and the USA, has been a very key point, a part of, including working for this person.
Oh my gosh. Well, now my heart is beating. I mean, not only the Beatles, but Stan. I see the two, the Beatles and Stan Lee, as being such a huge part of the 60s. Stan, I always say, Stan was doing in comics what the Beatles were doing in music.
Yes,
and the corresponds.
Yeah,
you know, his first, the first comic of the new Marvel age came out in 1961, The Fantastic Four, and it changed everything in comics.
Absolutely.
Beatles, you know, a year later in '62, and then they were going neck and neck. And Stan was the guy who recognized the Beatles once, you know, and the Beatles appeared in a Marvel comic. No sooner had they been on Ed Sullivan's show than they were actually featured in a Marvel comic. So he was really on the ball and in tune with, certainly with this kid growing up at that time, equally as much as the Beatles. And when I came to work with Stan years later, there was that moment of, oh God, is this going to be a mistake? Because he's been my hero since I was 7 years of age. And I went in and, oh God, it was just sheer joy, absolute sheer joy. Much like John Lennon, he did not suffer fools in any way whatsoever. So somehow I got away with him. And he was everything you'd want Stan Lee to be. Luckily, years later, when was it? 1993, I was able to actually interview him for the South Bank show. Which was a fantastic experience, and a very brief story, because no, this isn't my book, but just before I went in to interview him, I was pulled aside by a very officious Marvel marketing man who said, "Now, when you're interviewing him, don't mention DC Comics, the rival. I will stop the interview if you mention DC Comics." And I'm like, "Oh, for God's sake!" I go in, sit down, the camera starts rolling. So Stan, can you tell me how it all started? And Stan says, well, of course, it all started at DC Comics. Without DC Comics, we wouldn't be anything. And I'm looking over the camera at this marketing person. There's no way they're going to stop Stan. Had I been the one to bring it up. For the next 20 minutes, he extolled the virtues of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and so on. And quite rightly, too, because, you know, without those guys, the whole superhero thing would not have come about.
Did you know, maybe it wasn't in your time, a guy's Marvel called Jim Starlin? He reimagined Captain Marvel for...
Of course I knew, yeah, they got Warlock and so many wonderful...
Yeah, of course he creates probably Marvel's greatest villain due to the movies, which is Thanos.
Yeah.
I'm only mentioning this because... you can probably tell by now if I've got
we're really entering nerd territory now.
I'll keep this brief. Ever since the and there's another bit, the cross references a bit with Tim here. Ever since when I was a schoolboy in the 1950s, I had an aunt, my mother's younger sister, who married an American Air Forceman who was stationed over here, as many still were in the 1950s. And due to the American Air Force bases having their own supplies called PX, I used to get American comics. And in the 1950s, they were still black and white in England, because after the war and austerity, there were limits on print runs and color was expensive. So having these color comics was fantastic. And it led to me actually having a little kind of, with schoolboy friends, etc., kind of, if you like, business when I finished with them, selling these comics. And it led to me later being involved in vinyl records, in vintage vinyl. I had a vintage vinyl, the original vintage vinyl shop in Bournemouth back in the 1960s. And some of this, in a sense, came from this comic thing at the beginning. But I mentioned Jim Starlin and Captain Marvel, because I was such a big fan in the early 70s of this, that getting hold of some of them was quite difficult. Some of the early versions, earlier issues of this, and when my wife and I, my wife's an artist, Abby Kremer. Yes, you can look at her online as well, actually. She and I were in America in 1977. This was, and I remember going to comic book shops in Los Angeles, filling in the gaps in my Captain Marvel collection.
Oh, that's wonderful.
When I had the first 50 issues, I now have them, and have for many years, have them bound into 2 volumes. So I'm quite an enthusiast for Jim Starlin. My biggest enthusiasm with comics, though, is from as Tim will know well, from the early 50s, well, throughout the decade, it was Frank Hampson.
Yes.
Great Stan Dare.
Yes.
To the degree that...
Well, I'm sitting here in Southport, which is where the Eagle was created.
The video was.
So
yeah.
I'm about 10 minutes from the church hall.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Look, what I'm going to suggest...
Just briefly, in the 80s, there were a series of reprints, hardback volumes, of everything down there, 10 volumes. I have all of these. This is the level of when you get captured, as of course Tim was, on both sides of the event, of comic book stories. As Tim will wonderfully tell you in his book, I don't want to give the game away, but right at the beginning, you talk about Stone Age men and women and their immediate daubs on the walls. This is the beginning of storytelling and comic books. It is that important, folks, along with rock and pop music.
And well, how lovely. Yes, I love that. And it's just come into my head, John, you've got to come to Liverpool. And you've got to come to the Liverpool Beatles Museum, because I think you go down a bomb there. We have special events there where people give talks, and your talk on the Beatles would be so entertaining.
That's a very kind thing to say. Well, you never know. Do you know something?
We've got to set this up. We've got to set this up.
I've never been. Mark invited us to the book launch of Tune In, his first volume. And ironically, that's something we might have gone to and would then have been in Liverpool. He took place in the Liverpool Institute, which you'll know well.
I do, yes.
But the next day or the day before, my wife had an exhibition opening, of her own work that we couldn't. So we couldn't go.
Well, I'm going to say,
Mark, one thing he said. When, as I say, the Rickenbacker story didn't make it to volume 1, he actually, the day it was published, that book, he sent me an inscribed copy, which was an absolutely delightful thing. And as Tim said, you know, the years are going by now, but hopefully we'll get volume 2 out soon. Then I'll be able to stop telling people my version of the Men from Rickenbacker. Anyway, that's an absolutely lovely invitation.
It's an open invitation, and I think it would be a great day there at the Liverpool Beatles Museum, which is run by Pete Best and his brother Rogue Aspinall Best. So it would be lovely for you to be connected with Rogue Aspinall Best after.
Well, they have talks and things there as well.
They do indeed. Well, this is something you and I will discuss over the next few days.
When my first book came out, it was a different era.
Yeah.
By 2012, different era. Lots changed since then. I did various signings and things. I did talks and things. One at a World Book Night thing in a library, and the German Beatle fan club of Germany, 50 years on from Magical Mystery Tour, came to England and toured everywhere the Beatles went, filming Magical Mystery Tour. They invited me to give them a talk, which I did, and that was lovely. But this time round, for various reasons, I haven't done any of these things, which is partly to do with the fact that I'm now 77 plus years old, and you start sort of scaling things down and back.
I've
Otherwise,
noticed
I'd
that.
be saying I'm on the next flight.
I'm a mere boy myself by comparison, but I've noticed I'm starting scaling things back a bit. However, this might be one that, who knows, we might be able to figure a way around. Okay. Jon, it's been a delight. Once again, boys and girls, it's New Haven Publishing. Go over, you'll find many more details about Chain Reaction by Jon Kremer. Okay, never let it be said I get the name wrong twice. You need it on your bookshelf. I don't care if you've got 10 billion books about the music industry. This is something quite different and a total delight to read. Jon, thank you so much. I suspect we're going to be talking again before you know it about all sorts of things. So I look forward to that. And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, good night from me. And
I'm beginning to sound like a well-known UK double act from the 70s, and it's good night from him.
Good night.
Yes, good night.